Just before dawn on February 17, 1944, the deck crews aboard the aircraft carrier Enterprise moved with practiced urgency as engines warmed and signal lights flickered in the darkness. At exactly 8:37 a.m., the first wave of Grumman F-6F Hellcats thundered off the flight deck and vanished into the black sky over Truk Lagoon. From his flagship nearby, Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance watched the launch in silence. Around him, 9 carrier task groups of the U.S. Fifth Fleet were coming to life, preparing to execute an operation that would quietly change the course of the Pacific War. Operation Hailstone was underway, and its target was believed by many to be untouchable. Truk was known as the Gibraltar of the Pacific. For more than 20 years, the Japanese Empire had transformed this remote atoll into the most heavily fortified base outside the home islands. A massive barrier reef encircled the lagoon, stretching nearly 40 miles across. Inside it lived between 10 and 12,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen. 5 airfields dotted the islands, each protected by hardened revetments packed with aircraft. Coastal defense guns commanded every approach. Underground bunkers carved deep into volcanic rock could shelter the entire garrison from bombardment. Fuel depots brimmed with aviation gasoline and bunker oil. Ammunition magazines were stocked for prolonged siege. Truk was not just a base. It was the beating heart of Japanese naval power in the Central Pacific. American planners knew exactly what Truk was. They had studied it for years. Filing cabinets overflowed with invasion scenarios, casualty projections, beach landing diagrams, and naval gunfire plans. Every serious analysis reached the same conclusion: a direct assault would be catastrophic. Taking Truk would require multiple Marine divisions, weeks of bombardment, and brutal house-to-house fighting through fortified positions. Casualties would likely exceed those at Tarawa. And yet, the carriers steaming toward Truk that morning were not preparing for an invasion. They were executing a strategy the Japanese High Command had never fully imagined. The Americans were not going to take Truk. They were going to make it irrelevant. For generations, warfare against fortified positions followed a brutal logic. You identified the enemy stronghold, assembled overwhelming force, smashed it with naval guns and airstrikes, then sent thousands of men ashore to fight for every foot of ground. The United States Marine Corps had followed this doctrine across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa. It worked, but it was killing Americans in horrifying numbers. The problem wasn't courage or training. It was mathematics. A defender behind prepared fortifications always held the advantage. They knew where the landings would come. They had months or years to prepare kill zones, tunnels, mines, and overlapping fields of fire. Even a 3-to-1 numerical advantage often wasn't enough. Sometimes even 10-to-1 failed. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 drove this lesson home with shocking clarity. BDO Island was barely 290 acres, little more than a strip of coral in the Gilbert Islands. The Japanese garrison numbered about 4,500 men. The Americans attacked with 18,000 Marines, supported by overwhelming naval and air power. They had intelligence, new amphibious vehicles, and some of the best-trained assault troops in the world. The bombardment before the landing was supposed to annihilate the defenses. It didn't. When the Marines approached the beach, Japanese defenders emerged from underground bunkers and opened fire. Low tide stranded landing craft on the reef, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under machine gun and artillery fire. Men fell by the dozens. Bodies sank into the lagoon or drifted in the surf. Those who reached the beach found themselves pinned down by interlocking fields of fire from concrete bunkers. The shoreline itself was a kill zone. The battle turned into savage close-quarters combat, fought bunker by bunker with flamethrowers, grenades, and satchel charges. Marines fought through exhaustion, darkness, and constant counterattacks. When Tarawa finally fell after 76 hours, more than 1,000 Americans were dead and over 2,000 wounded. Of the Japanese garrison, only a handful survived. The casualty ratio stunned military planners. If this was the price of a tiny atoll, what would the cost be for larger, more heavily defended islands? News of Tarawa ignited outrage at home. Families demanded answers. Newspapers questioned the strategy. Admiral Chester Nimitz received angry letters accusing him of murder. Military leaders understood the implications. Between Tarawa and Japan lay thousands of islands, many far stronger. If each required a frontal assault, American casualties could reach into the hundreds of thousands. Public support for the war itself might crack. The most terrifying example loomed to the south, Rabaul. Rabaul, on New Britain, was the cornerstone of Japan's South Pacific defenses. Since early 1942, the Japanese had poured resources into it without limit. 5 major airfields, hundreds of miles of tunnels, nearly 400 anti-aircraft guns, coastal batteries guarding the harbor, and supplies for a garrison that grew to over 110,000 men. It controlled vital sea lanes and projected air power across the entire region. To assault Rabaul directly would require the largest amphibious operation of the war so far, and casualties that would dwarf Tarawa. Marines who had survived earlier battles understood this intimately. Many believed they would not survive another frontal assault. In Brisbane in early 1943, General Douglas MacArthur stood over a map of the Pacific, studying those red circles marking Japanese strongholds. Rabaul was the largest. His staff had prepared plans to attack it directly. MacArthur read the casualty estimates and rejected them outright. There had to be another way. History had taught him that the greatest commanders avoided battles the enemy wanted to fight. Napoleon had done it. So had Lee. Victory came not from smashing strength head-on, but from maneuvering around it. What if Rabaul wasn't attacked at all? What if it was simply bypassed? The idea was radical in its scale. Islands couldn't retreat. If you cut their supply lines, they became prisons for their own garrisons. A Japanese soldier trapped on a bypassed island could not influence the war anywhere else. His weapons, training, and fortifications meant nothing without an enemy to fight. MacArthur refined the concept into what became known as leapfrogging. Admiral William Halsey immediately saw its potential. The plan was simple in theory and devastating in effect. Seize only those islands necessary to advance, build airfields, dominate the skies, and isolate the rest. Let enemy garrisons wither on the vine. There were objections. Bypassed bases could threaten supply lines. Japanese aircraft or submarines might strike from the rear. The strategy demanded near-total air and naval superiority. But by mid-1943, American industrial power had shifted the balance irrevocably. Essex-class carriers poured into the Pacific. New Hellcat fighters outmatched Japanese aircraft. Pilot training pipelines flooded the fleet with replacements Japan could never match. Attrition favored the United States overwhelmingly. At Quebec in August 1943, Allied leaders made the decision. Rabaul would not be invaded. It would be neutralized. Airfields would be built on Bougainville and in the Admiralty Islands, placing Rabaul under constant air attack and cutting off its supply routes. When American forces landed at Empress Augusta Bay in November, resistance was limited. Engineers hacked airstrips out of jungle. Within weeks, bombers were striking Rabaul daily. Japanese air power collapsed under relentless pressure. By early 1944, the once mighty fortress was surrounded, isolated, and strategically dead. The 110,000 men inside Rabaul could do nothing but endure. They farmed, fished, and waited. Their guns still pointed seaward. Their tunnels still sheltered them. But the war had moved on. Truk would be next. Everything Rabaul had been, Truk was, and more. It was the combined fleet's forward base, the logistical hub of the Central Pacific. American intelligence studied it with grim respect. Taking it by force would be a nightmare. So planners asked the same question they had asked at Rabaul. What if they didn't? Operation Hailstone was designed to answer that question. Task Force 58, under Admiral Mark Mitcher, assembled the most powerful carrier strike force the world had ever seen. 5 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, 6 fast battleships, hundreds of aircraft, and a ring of submarines waiting outside the lagoon. The Japanese sensed danger and withdrew their most valuable warships just in time. But they left behind dozens of transports, tankers, and smaller vessels, the arteries of their Pacific War effort. When American aircraft struck at dawn on February 17th, surprise was total. Japanese planes were destroyed on the ground. Fuel dumps burned. Ships exploded in the lagoon. By the end of 2 days, 45 ships lay sunk, hundreds of aircraft were destroyed, and Truk's airfields were shattered. American losses were minimal. The combined fleet never returned. Truk was bypassed, isolated, and doomed. Like Rabaul, its garrison waited for an invasion that never came. Supplies dwindled. Disease spread. Men died without firing a shot. The Impregnable fortress became a slow-motion death trap, rendered irrelevant by strategy rather than force. By mid-1944, hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops sat marooned on bypassed islands across the Pacific. They consumed food but contributed nothing to Japan's defense. When the Americans struck the Philippines, then Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, those troops were absent, trapped by a war that had moved past them. The leapfrogging strategy saved tens of thousands of American lives. It shortened the war. It demonstrated that the strongest fortress means nothing if it no longer matters. Rabaul and Truk remain today, quiet, overgrown, filled with tunnels, wrecks, and rusting guns, monuments not to strength, but to irrelevance. Japan prepared for one war. America fought another. And in that difference, the Pacific War was decided.